Right, so thank you all so much for joining our Open Documentation Hour. Just a couple of points. We're almost at 50 closed issues in the Open Documentation Academy repository, which is pretty amazing. So thank you all for kind of being involved. It's also a period of, it's kind of every 6 months at Canonical. We have towards the end of that 6 months, we have a planning period. And we're just about coming into that. And in fact, just before this meeting, we were talking about all the things that we could try and do to improve the Canonical Open Documentation Academy over the next cycle, such as finding ways of being responsive to the issues and organizing ourselves better when it comes to being able to adopt issues that may not necessarily be our own, or share issues, or flag those issues that other people can help with. So yeah, if you know, if you want to get in touch and let us know places where you think we can improve, you know, get in touch with any of us privately or me privately, or leave a comment on the forum. Maybe I'll create a post actually on the discourse forum to say, looking for your feedback. I think I did that 6 months ago, just when we'd started. So I'll do that again, and it'd be great to get your comments on that. I'm sorry it took me a bit of time, but I think yesterday I got up last Friday's really excellent documentation hour with Christian, who was the engineering director, talking about documentation. That's on our YouTube on Air channel. And today I'm really grateful to Jana, actually, who's going to do, I was going to do something on synthesizer manuals, which I will do next week. But I've not been able to give it the time it probably deserves. It takes at least a week to read the average synthesizer manual. So Jana has very bravely offered to step in and talk about documentation and accessibility. So I'm going to hand you over to Jana. Thanks, Jana.
Thank you. So, hi everybody. For those who haven't met me, my name is Jana, and I'm a technical author at Canonical. And let me, without further ado, share my screen super quickly so we can start, well, our presentation. Let me know when you see my slides. Just, I don't know, tell me something or raise your hand or something. I have only one monitor, so I can't really see.
We can see, it looks great.
Okay, cool. So let's start. I'm going to kick off with a quick, maybe a questionnaire. It is an example of, you know, like a digital form or a poll that one might use in whatever context. It asks, which is the right angle triangle on this picture? And ideally in the menu or the digital form that's going to be, you would be able to click it, you know, the option, and maybe pick something like next or confirm your choice. But in our case, just, you know, drop the answer in the chat. So which out of these four angles, triangles that are displayed here is the right angled one? I hear a hand maybe raised, or... Okay,
No,
well, I hope the answers to the chats are rolling, and you can clearly see that the right angle triangle is green. But if there are colorblind users among you, this question might not be that straightforward, because in the next slide, I'm going to demonstrate how one type of color blindness, which is called anomalous trichromacy, when one of the colors in the primary color is affected, the perception of it is affected, is perceiving the same image. So you can already see, if you're not colorblind, that the colors are already a little distorted. You can still kind of make a guess because, well, to me personally, this still looks kind of greenish, and this looks greenish, and this looks greenish. But if we go further and we look at another type of color blindness, which is called dichromacy, where a person can only perceive two colors clearly, you can already see that the picture is getting very, very, very muddy, because we are relying on the color as our source of information and the primary identificator, but actually the person who is perceiving this color does not work, their color perception is not working on this assumption that they are able to perceive these colors as we have assumed. And if we go another step forward, which showcases another type of color blindness, you would see that the picture is even more difficult. So how would I fix if I had to rely on this sort of poll for something in my documentation or in any work or in any web design? Is, well, the slides are a little in a wonky order, is something like this. And this is the official recommendation of the accessibility guidelines, is to provide an alternative identificator to the information that you're conveying. So when we're looking at this picture, the triangles are clearly labeled as 1, 2, 3, 4, and not only identified by colors. So if a person is colorblind, they wouldn't have a problem of identifying a right angle triangle because it's clearly labeled as 1. Is this a big of a deal? So yes, the answer is yes. Color blindness is one type of visual impairment, and it's rather widespread. These numbers are very estimated because difficult types of color blindness affect different genders differently sometimes, and it's spread out, in slightly inconsistent way. But if we estimate roughly, very roughly, you can see that in some cases, 1 out of 100 people, 1 out of 20 people, 1 out of 200 people is experiencing one type of color blindness or the other, which is not that, that rare. Again, there might be even colorblind users with us on the call, so they might have some of the thoughts on this presentation after I finish. This is a very widespread visual impairment, but it is not the only one. 1 out of 6 people in the world has some type of disability. Disability ranges from visual to sensory to hearing to cognitive. It can be permanent or chronic, or it can be temporary. Most of you probably had a temporary disability at some point of your life if you broke one of your limbs, or if you were hospitalized for some reason, or if you just were very, very, very sick, or if you were a single parent and you had to carry your infant around all day around your house and you had only one hand that you could use. Disability is prevalent and it affects our lives daily. And the most important thing from us as producers of our product, right? We are technical authors or writers or aspire to be them. We want our product to be good. And one of the, in my opinion, one of the most important characteristics of the product, other than it being usable, user-friendly, fulfilling the needs of the customer, is that it is accessible. Because as you can see, 1 of the 6 people in the world is experiencing one or the other type of disability, either permanently or temporarily. And it would be weird to assume that 1/6 of the world is not our potential users or cannot benefit from the product that we're developing. So not only, if you don't consider accessibility when designing your documentation or working on your documentation, not only you risk on losing or missing out on potential customers and users, you also risk breaking the law in many jurisdictions. If you're in the US, you probably have heard of Section 508 or ADA. These are 2 important laws that govern how digital products should be designed with accessibility and inclusivity in mind. So if you're a company or if you are working for a company that deals with American markets, you are likely going to be asked to make your products accessible, including your documentation. So this is another slide from the US Census Bureau, where they've broken down the prevalence of disability in different age groups. And it's not broken down by different types of disabilities, but there is data on that also if you're curious. I'm going to post all of the links in the chat after I finish the presentation. And as you can see, the older we get, the more disability we experience in our daily lives. So disability is part of our lives, and to make our world better and more accessible, and to make our digital space better and more accessible, we need to consider it at every stage of the design of our product. So, as a technical author, what can you do to make your product, your documentation, more accessible? There are obviously specific guidelines and rules and requirements developed by, experienced third parties who specialize in these things, and I'm going to cover some of those with the examples later. But in my experience, it's useful to keep in mind like 4 rules of thumb. First of all, when you're writing documentation or you're creating any sort of experience for your users, try to convey all of the information through the written text. If you are relying, as we saw on the previous example, on some additional information such as color, font, size, sounds, images, even layout or some media, it should only serve as a supplementary role, a supporting role. Anything that you create in your documentation should be able, a reader should be able to understand it just by reading it. If they disable all of the images, they should still be able to get the story straight. If they turn on a monochromatic view on their monitor, they should still be able to follow all of your instructions and to get the information that they need from your documentation. So, simple rule, convey everything through written text. Rule number 2, do not assume how the reader will consume and interact with the interface that presents your documentation. So the website or the file, maybe you're going to be sending PDF files or something like that. And do not write the instructions as in documentation with this assumption in mind. So you don't know whether the person is going to be clicking or pressing, whether they're going to be using a mouse or whether they're going to be using a keyboard or a touch screen, whether they will be using a screen reader for all of their interactions. You usually don't really have that much insight, so it's better to not assume. Rule number 3, and this is a rule that touches all of the aspects of documentation, always test it. Sometimes you cannot test the product that you're writing about, but you can always test the accessibility of your documentation. Try reading it with a screen reader. There are plenty of free options out there. Disable your, not mouse, it should be mouse, my apologies for the typo. Disable your mouse and try navigating your documentation website just by using the keyboard. Or you use it the other way around, disable your keyboard. If you have access to a tablet or a phone, try opening your documentation website and navigate it through the touch screen. Do the instructions make sense when you're using them from an interface that you might not be very familiar with or that might not be your primary choice of the interface? Try resizing, sizing up and sizing down. Does the website look okay? Is the content still consumable? When you say that something is located in the like lower left corner, and when you size it up to 200%, is it still in the lower left corner? Sometimes as a technical author, you might not have influence or impact on the design of the website yourself, as in you're not going to be developing it yourself. But if you do notice these discrepancies, you should raise these issues to whoever is developing, to your web team, to your front-end designers, usability experts, whoever is working on this. But more often than not, I would say a lot of this is going to be in your hands, so it will be up to you to fix it. And rule number 4, do not ever consider accessibility as a nice to have. It's not an afterthought. It's not an issue that you're going to fix later. As I mentioned, good products are accessible products, and really this is not negotiable. If you're developing something and it's documentation, the overhead for making it accessible is so small that most people really have no excuse for not making this kind of effort. You're not rebuilding a whole building, you're just making sure that the text that you've written is accessible to users of different abilities. That's not rocket science, to put it simply. So just think about it, test your documentation, try it with different interfaces. That's as good start as many. So if we're going to look at this particular recommendations that cover different aspects of documentation, we might look at something like this. So colors, fonts, and contrast. I think a lot of these are going to be quite intuitive because not only they when people break these rules, not only they make documentation inaccessible, they sometimes make it very hard to use even for people without, for example, visual impairment. So, sufficient contrast between foreground and background. As you can see in this example, when the contrast is low, it's very difficult to read, even if you have perfect eyesight. So just be mindful of that. Don't use color alone to convey information. You can use it as a supporting role, but never rely on it alone. As I mentioned, everything in your documentation should be understandable without reliance on any other objects in your documentation other than text itself. Font types can have a significant impact on readability, especially for people with dyslexia or with different kinds of visual impairment. The general guideline is to use sans serif, Roman, or monospace font types. It's been researched by people who are way smarter than me, and somehow they concluded that some of these fonts are easier to read than others. I don't exactly know the psychology of it and how it works, but it does. So if your company and designers decide on an official font to use, just send them this link. Next, interactive elements on your documentation website must always be easily identifiable. So headings, links, navigation buttons, items in your TOC, sometimes labels or tags, they should be programmable to be the object that they are. So for example, don't create a heading just by using a bold font. Actually use an appropriate heading role in your HTML, or whether you're building PDF and so on and so forth. If you're creating a link, first of all, it should be a link. You can rely on some visual aids. As you can see, there is a link here, which I can click it and it's going to lead me to some website. And you'd be surprised, but there is a link here also. It's just not designed, the presentation of it was not designed appropriately. So, oops. So make sure that whatever you use in your documentation can be clearly identified visually and programmatically. Provide navigation tips on your documentation website. Breadcrumbs, clear headings, maybe paths to the files. If whatever the structure is, make sure that the reader always knows where they're located and how to go back or how to orient themselves in the information that you're presenting to them. Ensure that form elements include clearly associated labels. I think that's pretty clear. If somebody asks you to submit a form, they better sign where the comment goes and where the email goes, and not just present you with two empty forms that you have to figure out what goes where. And if your readers or users interact with anything on your documentation website and they make a mistake, they should receive an easily identifiable feedback. So for example, they're trying to log into their documentation, to your documentation website, and they input incorrect password or their username. They should receive feedback about that, so they know what they're doing wrong. Use headings and spacings to group related content. I think that's a pretty understandable and easy for us to accept this kind of requirement. Nobody likes huge blocks of uninterrupted text. But as I mentioned, not only headings must be used to semantically separate blocks of content from one another, they should be programmed, as in you should use an appropriate role. So a person who, for example, uses only screen reader or a keyboard can easily navigate your page. Don't rely solely on visual formatting. Do it both visually and programmatically. That's the best way to do it. Links are the most common offenders in web accessibility and documentation accessibility in general. Links should always be distinguishable from one another. If the destinations are different, they should not introduce any ambiguity. So do not ever say something like click here, and then click here, and see this page. Clearly identify where you're sending the reader. So give them meaningful descriptive names. Do not leave the URLs bare, as in with no descriptive words, because if you try running this through a screen reader, you would find that screen reader process these quite literally. So the screen reader would read something like, click here and https : / and so on and so forth. Really not usable. So most style guides would have recommendations about these, and usually these fulfill accessibility best practices or guidelines too. So make your link names descriptive, succinct, non-ambiguous. Don't use naked URLs. Media. Media is fun to use, and it sometimes enhances the experience of documentation. Pictures, diagrams, sometimes interactive elements. Sometimes I've seen even GIFs or GIFs, whatever you call it, that demonstrate, how certain functions work in, like a real environment. Videos, sounds, all of those are great tools to enhance your documentation and to enhance the learning experience. But as I mentioned, they should never be the solely source of information. If you are using and you cannot avoid using a certain type of media, for example, a video is a video, make sure that you provide an alternative. So if you have a video or an audio, like a podcast, provide a transcript, provide subtitles. If you've got images, they should all be accompanied by alt texts. If you have anything that conveys important information and is not of decorative, does not serve a decorative role, it should have an alternative, just purely text written alongside of it or as an alt text. Basically, if you happen to disable all of the media on your docs website, the docs should still be understandable, clear, and consumable. Alt texts are really, really important, and people often forget about them or don't take proper care of them. Alt text should be succinct. They should convey the information that you're trying to communicate by the image. So the point is not to describe the image itself, but to convey its purpose. And as it says here, to represent the purpose and function of the image. So for example, when you see something like this, it's a question mark that would link to a help page and is intended to encourage users to click if they need support. Just describing it as something like a circle with a question mark does not really convey the function of this image and what it's supposed to do. A more useful alt text would be contact support. There are fantastic guides written by, I believe, Harvard writers on how to create alt texts that are functional and useful. And again, I've provided a link here, and I'm going to repost it in the chat after I finish with the slides. Language. Default spoken language must always be programmatically identified for each page, or if you have certain content blocks that use, for some reason, different language, that should always be programmatically identified in the HTML or the PDF of your documentation. The reason, screen readers can get very, very confused, and you really don't want a screen reader who tries to read a language that does not actually match the language of the content. It's a terrible experience, and we shouldn't do this to our users ever. Use inclusive language. I'm not going to go too deep into this because there are, again, fantastic guides written everywhere. If you're working for a company, or if you plan to work for a company that doesn't have a style guide, or that just in the process of adopting or developing a style guide, make sure to draw some inspiration from already existing style guides on inclusive language and incorporate that in your internal organizational rules. And here is a bunch of resources that would be very useful if you want to study the topic further. The most important and the most useful, I guess, in my opinion, is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, short WCAG. They have two versions, number 2 and number 3. Both are perfectly fine for modern day use. Number 3 is obviously a little bit more up to date, a little updated, but if your documentation website follows the accessibility guidelines from the version number 2, it's still better than many players in the market do. There are other content and guides developed by US Access Board and a bunch of other government organizations who take care of accessibility of digital spaces. And this part, I like it because it creates a little bit of the insight into how people with different abilities actually use digital products or websites or digital spaces in general. So if you have troubles, like just even imagining what it's like to not rely for something like visual information in your day-to-day and just to use auditory files, like whatever's produced by the screen readers, I suggest just looking up some of the stories and seeing how people interact with computers. It's very insightful, useful, and often inspiring, in my opinion. So that was it. It was rather short, but I hope it was useful. And if you've got any questions, or if you want to share your experiences with what kind of content or what kind of web design you find inaccessible or not very useful or convenient to use for you, feel free to share them. I think it's going to be a very interesting and useful discussion for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jana. It wasn't too short at all. It was perfect. I'll read Jeffrey's. Jeffrey's left a comment. Thank you for the information, Jana. I especially like the example with the question mark. I wouldn't have thought of that. I occasionally use tools that crawl my website to identify issues related to page performance, security, search engine optimization, and mobile experience. Are there any tools that will similarly help me scan websites for Section 508 compliance?
Yes, I'll find some links to open source tools. Obviously, there are many commercial products that will develop, these tools for you and optimize them for you. But I'll take a look in my bookmarks and I'll give you some links to open source solutions that do that. Yes, absolutely, there are solutions for automating this work.
And Robert's raised his hand. Go for it, Robert.
Yeah, we actually use one of those solutions as an automated check on Ubuntu or Canonical documentation. I'm not sure how widespread it is, but I find it pretty good. It's very nice in that it, for example, is also able to identify one of the things that Jana mentioned when the text or links are not distinctive enough, and it also says, for example, when colors do not have enough contrast, and so on. So it's pretty good.
Anyone else who may have a question, please feel free to either type them out or raise your hand if you'd like to. Jana, have you actually looked at our? I know that you have, but have you looked at kind of Canonical or Ubuntu documentation? And what's your kind of general impression of how kind of compliant or easy to accessible it is?
I think our website in general, our web team is doing a great job with these, but we do have a lot of slip-ups with links, with using a non-ambiguous link targets like click here or see this, or sometimes we rely on, like the positioning of something within the text, like, look above or look at the left upper corner or something, which actually changes when you try to change the size or the resolution of the screen. So small things like that. I think it's just a matter of habit of like checking these things when you're reviewing content, and in general, we're doing a good job. And as Robert mentioned, we've got some automated tools that we can use, so more teams should just enable accessibility checks in their pipeline when they're checking for spelling and stuff like that. But overall, I think we have some slip-ups here and there, but it's a good experience. But to get a full picture, again, I'm not an accessibility expert. To get a full picture would probably need an accessibility audit from people who specialize in this kind of thing.
Iqbal has said, I listened to a podcast from the Late Night Family, whatever that is, where an accessibility tester mentioned that there were GUI frameworks that were simply inherently accessible through screen readers. If I recall correctly, they were complaining specifically about Rust. Their suggestion was to test for accessibility at the earliest stage when writing software, stating that it may be too difficult later in the process. Late Night Linux Family, yeah, I had guessed might be something to do with them. I don't want to put Nicholas on the spot, who's in this meeting, but Nicholas is well, he does some front end development, and I wondered. I mean, don't worry if you can't, Nicholas, but it'd be really interesting. I'd be really interested to know, how do you think about accessibility when you're writing basically site functionality, and how do you kind of, is that a fair question even?
It is. I think sadly I can talk from my experience in my previous work and in here, like, we actually don't take that into account a lot. Like, if there's not someone in the team which has something that you have to take into account, you mostly assume it should be fine, which is terrible. And I agree completely that it's terrible. So, but yeah, I think something that happens with programmers is that if you don't have someone that has something different, you maybe not take it into account in most of the cases. And I do try to, like, after learning about it in some classes, I do try to take it more into consideration. So when I am like creating tooltips or images or alt text, I try to like be more meaningful within it. But I don't know if most software developers do that. In most cases, I don't think so.
And I also guess that it requires, like when you're planning features, it requires at the planning stage for time to be put into the development. So there's an actual trade-off. Somebody's got to say, no, you can spend so much time making this compliant in a way that maybe doesn't often get
Yeah, I have noticed that more and more sites have gone compliant with accessibility in the color scheme wise. So they do have like a specific settings, and if you have a specific type of I forgot the names that Jana mentioned, I'm sorry, but those kind of specific accessibility issues, you can actually select, and the whole theme of the page will change so that it's easier for you to implement. So I think that's one of the best and easier features to implement in a way, because if you have a specific theme that just change, like you have 4 different theme files, and you can just change based off the preference of the users, it will help a lot.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for answering. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but
No problem.
We're lucky to have you here. Anybody else like to ask a question? I do have a few, but I don't like to. I don't dominate it with. Do you think? I mean, Jana, in the time that you've been interested in this, do you think things are improving in terms of accessibility and people adopting standards, or getting worse? In general, kind of.
Yes, I mean, accessibility and usability are largely interconnected. I fail to see any company who employs like usability experts who would not be considering accessibility as part of it. And we also hire more diverse employees to our workplaces who bring more insight into their unique experiences. In some of the links that I put there, there are talks from fully blind developers who program pretty complicated stuff, in things like in stuff like Visual Code or some of those other IIDs. It would be really a shame to not listen to the feedback of, such brilliant, talented experts, and to just lose out on their talent in your work. So yeah, I feel like the companies are getting more interested into it. It's stocked more. So in my opinion, that's a great development, at least, in my bubble, in a society where I get to interact, and in the digital spaces where I have to be in. One of the fun part was, I don't know if you're like involved in social media, but there was, the Twitter dawn kind of happened, and a lot of people moved to a decentralized network that emulates Twitter functionality called Mastodon. What I found is that there is a pretty strong culture of people taking care of alt text. So everything that gets posted, even memes, funny pictures of cats and stuff like that, people take really great care of providing alt text themselves. They often point out when alt text is missing. The developers pay attention to enabling alt text in different languages, depending on the instance of Mastodon. So it surprised me, because I didn't really see this much care previously in big social media outlets. But Mastodon culture, it's huge, and all of the IT nerds are currently there. So I do see improvements, and I think it's a positive trend.
Actually, Iqbal mentioned that exact same thing very much earlier on in the comment section, that the alt text on Mastodon was so widely used.
So, are there any discussions about accessibility for neurodiversity?
Of course, yes. So, sorry, Iqbal, you raised your hand. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Iqbal.
Okay, maybe, yeah.
Iqbal's left a comment. Shall I read it out? I don't know if you want to answer Bill's question first.
Let me answer Bill's question. Definitely, there is a lot of studies being done on how people with different cognitive abilities, I guess, perceive written and visual information. So a lot of things you find around how to structure the information is actually written with these considerations in mind. So, for example, people who struggle that all of us do, especially with technical documentation, we all struggle to maintain focus, but people who struggle specifically with attention deficit disorders of different types, because there are plenty of them, as far as I'm concerned, the recommendation is to write documentation that you can easily pass rather than read, book to book, which kind of matches our general principles of how we write documentation, right? There are studies on how people read technical documentation, even like when with tracing their eyesight. So it's called, I forgot the technical or the scientific term for it, but it's called this kind of pattern, where people just look at the title and maybe the subtitle, and then they quickly pass maybe one first sentence, and then they quickly pass like the bullet points to the left side, if they're readers of the language that writes from left to right. For people of who use different script, obviously the pattern is going to be slightly different, and those are even more prominent for people on the spectrum. So structuring your documentation with these considerations in mind will already help. Things like experiencing every page as page one is very helpful because, again, distractions and change of context is sometimes very costly, especially for people on the spectrum. So you should write your documentation without people having to jump from place to place or to go to a different page to consult something. You're trying to provide like a holistic experience, which matches, the general trend I've seen in technical writing, regardless of accessibility or not. But by following this trend and these ideas, you're kind of addressing the needs of people on the spectrum too. I am not an expert, obviously, on the area of, different neurodivergent things and abilities. So maybe people would, even in the comments or, on the call might have more insight.
Thanks, Yana. Something I have to be very careful of is being sarcastic or being ironic, or introducing any kind of sense of humor into the things that I write, even if I think it's like benign. It's probably only me that thinks that. I'll just read out Iqbal's comment. I fear that once again we stumble against the limited resources and utilitarianism problem in FOSS when testing for accessibility. There are areas in my work where there are only 2 to 3 libraries that we can rely on. If I need any of them and they break accessibility, as they tend to do, my responsibility will be to prioritize those features over accessibility. Iqbal goes on, I don't often have the time or skills to actually fix these incompatibilities, and I've been left in the dark when I requested help from others. Not out of malice, of course. Most people only really solve their issues, and I can't blame them.
Yes, of course, it's a problem of the whole ecosystem, and this is why I think it's important to bring, just to have a conversation about it. When I mention things like, there is no excuse, I'm talking primarily the domain of documentation, which you don't have deep, intricate dependencies to format your links correctly, right? Or to write documentation without reliance on complicated diagrams or providing all text for those diagrams. The text is all there. We have the natural language to convey information. Yes, when we're talking about the accessibility of software and hardware and a bunch of other things, that's a more complicated topic. I do encourage to join maybe working groups, in whatever tech you're working at. And if you find that this is something that you can bring yourself to care about, I think you can bring a lot of good to the world by just, even pushing the conversation one step further.
Thanks. Just before I get to you, Peter, Faith has left a comment to say, love the presentation. Are there guidelines for people who are more visual-based, understanding products and documentation through images?
Yes, I think this is largely a domain of usability. There are plenty of great resources on how to convey information without reliance on text. It's especially useful in the context where you have an international audience. So sometimes people might not even speak, the language that you're writing in, or you are unable to translate it. I'd suggest looking into usability research. I have a couple of good books lying around my house I can pick up and write down the title.
Thanks, Yana. Peter, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. First, can you hear me? Because last week I had a Bluetooth issue, so I don't know if that works. I mean, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so my question, I'm not really sure if it's about if it's completely related to accessibility in this particular context, but if it's not, you can just stop me. The question is about information architecture, structuring information in documentation. It's about the diathesis principle, which many companies use now, including Canonical. And it's about two things, right? In the sense that it talks about how you can shape how you can shape information and how you can structure information. My question is basically, let me just get my question. I've seen many people just cluster the diathesis principle when they are structuring their information, tutorials, how to guides, tutorials, how to guides, this, that. And I feel like there are cases where I've read documentation where it just feels confusing because they structure the information. I mean, they follow the diathesis principle completely in structuring the information. And I feel like this could have gone differently. I mean, just personally, I find it confusing. So my question to you, Yana, is how does, like, what do you think is, because I feel like you work at Canonical. Canonical uses diathesis principle, and it just feels like, is it when structuring information, are there situations where you feel like people that use people that use the principle do not have to follow the principle when structuring information? Like they could apply the principle in the how information is divided, but do they have to apply it when it comes to structuring? I don't know if you get my question. Honestly, it's just something that popped into my head right now. It's not really,
Yeah,
so I don't know. It might seem confusing, kind of.
No, I understand what you're asking. So at Canonical, this is interesting, and this is a challenge that we face every day. We are working very closely with the UX team, so the user experience team, who study exactly how, at some products, obviously, the resources are always limited, but they study how our users and readers, consume the product, so how they interact with the product, and where are those instances where they need to refer to information, and do they need to study it? Do they need to learn it? Do they need to refer to it? Do they need to quickly look it up? That already influences how we would structure information. Do we need an extensive tutorial so the people sit down and go through it for an hour and then they're free to go and work with the product, on their own? Or do they need a reference table for something where they quickly look up as they work on the regular workflow? So that's one aspect. And the second is the UX. I believe we had the conversation about that. The UX studies how they use the documentation itself. So there are like two different domains, at which point a user would consult documentation, and when they do consult it, how are they using it? Is the search efficient? What kind of information within the, on the micro level are they going to be looking for? Are we using the correct even keywords or the headings or the titles? So all of that goes into that part of research. I think you can connect it with accessibility, again, because people of different cognitive abilities, they process information differently, they study it differently, they memorize it differently. Sometimes people often need cues within information, or repetition of certain concepts, especially when we're trying to create an experience of studying. So like writing a tutorial, right? You need to repeat certain concepts if a person is unfamiliar with them. But that's, that's the nature of our jobs. I think every team at Canonical kind of approaches it by trying to learn in depth their customer and their target user, how they work with the product, and how in the end they consume documentation itself. Does it help? Did I answer your question?
Yeah. So I mean, what you are saying is internal data and company decision, it's kind of factors in, it's more important than whether it has to be diathesis, it has to be called diathesis principle or not. I mean, is that like your kind of like your conclusion?
Well, diathesis is just, if I heard you correctly, you were talking about that internal, like the data about users is more important than diathesis. Diathesis is just a framework, right? It's how you apply it really depends on, a specific product or the type of user and a reader that you have. I think we pretty much all agree that diathesis is largely an okay idea to guide us, but it's not, a set of laws and rules that you have to follow to a T. It's just something that we use to maybe structure our initial ideas better and then to iterate on them.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Yana.
Thanks, Yana. Jeffrey commented on Bill's question earlier on about accessibility for neurodivergence, and Jeffrey says, that's interesting. One of my staff members, a programmer, was dyslexic, and it was challenging for her to use some websites more than others. And I have no idea how she handled her disability for programming, but she was great outside of reading certain fonts and website contrast. Yeah, it's amazing how much of a difference a font makes. Even as someone, I don't think I'm dyslexic, but certain fonts really make things much easier to read. Last chance if anybody wants to ask Jana any questions. Iqbal says, thanks for the clear and informative presentation. I learned a lot. Thanks, Iqbal. If there are no more questions, I am once again going to thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thanks so much for putting this together. It was really interesting. I love it when these discussions, there's so much more that I can think about and just leaving, you know, with lots to think about. So thank you. And I'll stop the recording. Thanks everyone for joining.